Last time we met, we talked about the origins of Chinese civilization, the Chinese polity, and the multitude of dynasties that ruled China up to the modern period. That is approximately the year 1500. Today, we're going to continue with China. And in fact, I'm going to take us slightly beyond the year 1500. The reason for this is that after today, we're going to depart the Chinese narrative arc for the next several lectures. And when it intersects with the other narratives we're going to be developing in the intervening weeks, it will be more convenient for us to have moved the Chinese narrative up into the late 18th century, that is, the 1700s. So when we last left off, we were in the midst of the Great Ming Dynasty, which, as you will want to know for your quiz, was the last ethnically Han Chinese imperial dynasty. Something we weren't able to get to during the last lecture, something which makes the Ming somewhat singular from the perspective of the other Chinese imperial dynasties, is its period of deep water naval expeditions. Now, as you can see from the slides on the PowerPoint on Blackboard, um, Ming China has many of the characteristics of preceding Chinese imperial dynasties, as well as the Qing dynasty that will follow, namely its incredibly large army, economy, and sophisticated state apparatus. But the early Ming featured a period of incredible shipbuilding and travel around the Indian Ocean and South and East China Seas. You see on the slide here a map detailing the voyages of the great Ming eunuch Admiral Zheng He. Apart from noting the incredible range of some of these voyages, as you'll see, they reach all the way to the eastern coast of Africa, which is today's Somalia. I'd like you to just briefly note the locations of the Timurid Empire and the Delhi Sultanate, as we will be talking about their successor states as we move westward later in the lecture. These voyages resulted in the expansion of the Chinese tributary system, with emissaries being brought back to the imperial court. This political network was very loose, not like the later colonial projects of the Western Europeans we'll begin to look at the week after next. That is not to say they were not highly militarized or that these travelers to the imperial court were always voluntary. Far from it. However, the Chinese did bring things like silk, porcelain, etc. with them, so they were in many, if not most cases, welcomed. And in any case, this foray into overseas expansion was not to last. The voyages ended in 1433 and never resumed. Why did the Chinese stop? Why didn't they start traversing the globe, setting up colonies and converting the native populations? They had a large fleet, after all, and plenty of resources. Well, the fact is, no one is entirely sure. There are several theories, however, and the combination of reasons various scholars give no doubt get near enough to the truth for our purposes. First, floating such large fleets is extremely capital intensive, and it isn't as though the Chinese financial system was very sophisticated by today's standards, nor was tax collection very efficient. It just couldn't be. So there are fiscal causes. Then, the contemporary Chinese scholar Sui makes a very convincing case that the abandonment of the voyages was to a significant degree determined by bureaucratic infighting. That is, the fight between different departments of the government over power and purview. Think of arguments within our own establishment in Washington, D.C. today, between the Navy and Air Force, for example. One wants a new class of destroyers, the other wants more money for fifth generation fighter jets. Or how about fights between the Department of Homeland Security and FBI over who has authority over what, etc. The more things change, the more they stay the same, as the old saw goes. Related to the fiscal cause already detailed, it is possible the fleets were in part abandoned because of dangers on other frontiers and the need to shift resources to meet these threats. Because while the threat environment to the south was quite benign, most troubles there being internal, which we'll talk about here in a moment, you'll recall that China had been invaded many times from the north, hence the location of the Great Wall. And spoiler alert, China is going to be invaded yet again from the north very shortly here by the Manchus, who will establish the last of the Chinese imperial dynasties, that of the Qing, which will persist all the way through the first decade of the 20th century before finally succumbing to a variety of pressures we'll eventually talk about. So you have pressing security needs to the north. A decade after the fleet is abandoned, in fact, the Ming will fight a series of engagements with the Mongols, and then those internal problems we hinted at will crop up. The lengthy Miao rebellions in central China also occurring during the same period, approximately the 1540s to 1550s. You also had the absence of need. The treasure fleets weren't bringing back necessities. It is debated whether or not these ventures were breaking even. I tend to think not, but even if they were turning a small profit, they weren't bringing back necessities. Remember, China is arguably at its economic and technological peak of relative development. It is soon to be at its greatest territorial extent as well. But so its urge to seek new products, new markets, it just isn't all that pressing. Nor were these expeditions creating client states who could be used militarily against invaders like the Mongols or Manchus. Lastly, as mentioned by your textbook, the Chinese state religion, Confucianism, was not evangelical. There was no drive to go out proselytizing and making converts. So whatever the exact cause, we've listed the main reasons generally given. The fleets are abandoned, and the Ming turn inward, and just as I mentioned a little over a century later, they will be conquered by the invading Manchu. Although this really isn't the correct way to think about the transition from the Ming to the Qing, because the Qing were the descendants of the Jin, an earlier northern dynasty, one of several dozen odd other Chinese imperial dynasties that I just neglected to mention during our first lecture due to the constraints of time. But this means that the eventual Qing imperial leadership had been vassals of the Ming emperor. In fact, the beginning of this conflict over control of the Chinese state between the two is generally marked by the issuance by the Manchus of the Seven Grievances, which basically amounted to a declaration of war on their lord. Think of a barons' revolt occurring and gathering steam until, over the course of many years, decades in fact, you have to remember China is, even at this point, very large. There are a lot of different clans and local power brokers that have to be dealt with apart from the imperial forces themselves, but eventually the Qing Empire is established. In fact, although, as you'll see when you look at the PowerPoint, the Qing Empire is taken to have been established by the early 1640s, it isn't until 1683 that the last Ming loyalist stronghold, that of Formosa, that is the island of Taiwan, about 80 miles off the coast of the mainland, is conquered, and Qing rule is officially undisputed. Again, the more things change, the more they stay the same, as you'll see when we talk about the late 1940s and the Chinese Civil War between the forces of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. Before moving on, just a couple of things to note from the slide after this regarding the later Ming period. They grant trading rights to the Portuguese on the island of Macau in the later 16th century. We'll talk more about that in the coming weeks when we get to the Iberian explorers. Like all empires, fiscal problems were mounting though, unrest was brewing, and eventually things started to fall apart. In the language of the Chinese histories, the Ming were losing the mandate of heaven, which we talked about in the last lecture. But now, let's transition and take a look at our slide detailing the Qing. As you can see, the Qing carried out their wars of conquest. They were a very martial people, after all, the Manchus. They were to a significant degree already Sinicized, of course, something we talked about last time, in which your reading for the week mentions. But they extend the Chinese polity to its greatest territorial extent, pushing deep into Central Asia in a series of campaigns during the middle of the 18th century, that is the 1700s. That is, as we will see, the apogee of Chinese imperial power. However, as you can see on that slide, the Manchu dynasty begins encountering a series of problems around this time, both internal and external. These problems are only going to get worse. European traders are arriving in ever greater numbers, bringing with them drugs, foreign religions. The history of Christianity in China is interesting and variegated, though hardly central prior to the 19th century. We will talk more about that in subsequent lectures. Rebellions against the Manchu, which remember these are viewed as essentially foreign occupiers, these are a recurring problem, and one of the most serious rebellions takes place in the last decade of the 18th century. That is the White Lotus Rebellion, which, though it is put down, it comes at great cost and is one of those events which makes people wonder whether the Qing emperor is, losing the quote-unquote mandate of heaven. But we'll leave China here at present, at the zenith of its power. It seems a nice thing to do, since when we next introduce China to the narrative, picking up right here at the beginning of the 19th century, it's going to be for quite a bit of bad news. Everything from invasion to civil war, famine, revolution, invasion again, civil war again, near total destruction, famine again. The century of humiliations is, well, pretty much what it sounds like. Before we do, I'd like to read you something I put up on the slide here. It is an excerpt from a letter written on behalf of one of these Qing emperors to the King of Great Britain at the time. And it's in answer to British requests for trading, diplomatic, and religious rights. And I want to read it to you because I think it really gets at the heart of the kind of chauvinism I think comes naturally to great civilizations and empires, which, if you continue into historical studies, you will find abounds. And that is that we are the greatest, most important people ever anywhere. And so the quote is this. You, O king, live beyond the confines of many seas. Nevertheless, impelled by your humble desire to partake of the benefits of our civilization, you have dispatched a mission respectfully bearing your memorial. That is a portrait of the king. Although our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders, they had brought some gifts, some English manufacturers. There was therefore no need to import manufacturers of outside barbarians, the Europeans, in exchange for our own produce. But as the tea, silk, and porcelain which our celestial empire produces are absolute necessities to European nations and to ourselves, we have permitted, as a signal mark of favor, that foreign hongs, that is, merchant firms, should be established at Canton, this one port that they had opened up for the Europeans, so that your wants might be supplied and your country thus participate in our beneficence. The distinction between Chinese and barbarian is most strict, and your ambassador's request that barbarians shall be given full liberty to disseminate their religion is utterly unreasonable. And This was a Emperor Qianlong's letter to King George III, 1793. So, thought you might enjoy that. Okay, and with that, let's move on. To lands just west and south of those recently incorporated by the Chinese into their empire via those 10 great campaigns you saw mentioned on the slide about the Qing. Those Turkic Muslim lands that to this day prove troublesome to Beijing if you watch the news, Xinjiang. And let's move on to the rest of Central Asia, the Safavids, and to the Indian subcontinent, the Mughals. So, departing China for now and heading west, we encounter a series of what several prominent 20th century historians called the quote-unquote gunpowder empires, for their early adoption of muskets and cannon, which they used to conquer vast swathes of territory from people using pre-modern weaponry, that is swords, spears, etc. Like so many labels, that particular moniker has, since being coined, gone out of vogue. However, you do still hear it applied, so you might as well know it. These are in no particular order, although this is the order in which I'm going to talk about them: the Safavids, the Mughal, and the Ottoman. Now, I'm actually going to save the Ottomans for next week, as the masters of the Bosporus make a good segue, tying our hitherto Asiatic narratives into the European picture. So, regarding the Safavids and the Mughals, it actually makes more sense, I think, to talk about them together somewhat because they have common roots, at least at the level of a survey course, which, of course, this is. So, who were the Safavids? Unlike the various Chinese empires we've been discussing, which obviously revolved around China and the Chinese, it isn't immediately obvious whom we are talking about. However, it's essentially the Persians, today's Iranians. Now, if you recall back to our initial slide today, if you look on Blackboard about the Ming Empire and Jing He's voyages, you'll remember I told you to note the Timurid Empire. And this was the empire that was founded by the 14th century Turco-Mongol warrior Tamerlane. Now, his empire was a product of the fragmentation of the great Mongol Empire, which you saw in Lecture 1, and which subsequently broke down into four major parts, one of which was the Yuan dynasty of China, which we saw, another of which was the Ilkhanate of Iran and Iraq, which was 1256 to 1353 thereabouts, and from whence came Tamerlane. Tamerlane was a so-so empire builder. On a personal level, he claimed to share a patrilineal line with Genghis Khan. Whether that's true is unclear, and even if it isn't, myth-making, as we'll talk about, especially in the context of 19th century European nationalism, is often central to the state-making process. And though personally successful at conquering territory and trying to fuse different cultures together, it's where Sikhism is produced, attempted fusion of those two cultures. Tamerlane's successors are not able to hold his empire together. He was, as I said, himself not particularly politically adept and almost unfathomably violent, even by the standards of the day. But after a period of intense conflict and political maneuvering, the Safavid Empire emerged, and it will be with us for the next several hundred years. This is significant because it's the first time in almost a millennia since the emergence of Islam that the region once home to the great Persian empires of old, the Achaemenid and Sassanid, that is, the region is ruled by ethnic Persians again. We're going to talk about the Safavids more as well in the context of Islam, which is what we're going to close this week talking about. And the primary thing to remember about these Safavids is that they are really the bastion of Shia Islam, specifically Twelver Shiism. Extra credit for anyone who can remember that. We'll also return to the Safavids in the context of setting the board for the so-called Great Game, played between the British and the Russian empires for control over the region in the 19th century. The Russian Empire expanding southward, the British essentially concerned with protecting the approaches to India, an aspect of their grand strategy we'll discuss fairly extensively in the context of British policies during World War I and the subsequent creation of the modern Middle East. Moving south now to the Mughals, they also basically trace their roots to the Mongols, hence the similarity between the names, Mughals being a mispronunciation of Mongols. In fact, Babur, the first Mughal emperor, claimed descent from Genghis Khan. As an aside, a 2003 study by a team of geneticists found that the Y chromosomal haplogroup of about 8% of the male population of Asia can be traced back to Mongolia around the year 1000. Given what we saw during our lecture last week, the massive, if fleeting, reach of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, this isn't terribly surprising, I suppose, but I digress. Initially very similar to their neighbors to the northwest, these Central Asian Persian-speaking Muslims intermarried with Hindu royalty and produced an incredible fusion of culture, art, and society, some of the wealth of which is still visible today, such as the Taj Mahal. Although much of this that wasn't bolted down was pirated away by British nabobs during the period of East India Company rule prior to the establishment of the British Raj in the late 1850s, but we'll get to that. Now, quote-unquote India, as you'll see on the slide, was both highly politically developed but also highly politically fragmented. In fact, to borrow from the 19th century Austrian minister Metternich, India did not really exist other than as a geographical expression. Now, his original comment was directed at Italy, which, as we'll see in next week's lecture, was similarly developed but equally divided. And this has important consequences in the world of geopolitics, which I hope by now you realize is an intensely violent game. As we've had almost 2 full lectures now, and particularly as we're skimming along the top of things, it really does just seem like war, 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 war. And it is true, in the words of the great sociologist of European state formation, Charles Tilly, war made the state, and the state made war. It's a self-reinforcing process. Places like 16th century India or 19th century Italy being so divided made them easy prey for their more centralized neighbors who could marshal and concentrate more resources, specifically military resources, against them. This lack of socio-cultural and political unity also made it easy for invaders, once they arrived, to play groups off one another in the old divide and rule fashion. And this is precisely what happened. The British in particular had to rely on local auxiliaries due to their lack of numbers. Anyway, the most powerful of these Indian states during our period were the Delhi Sultanate, which we mentioned in the last lecture, a Muslim territory to the north, and the Vijayanagar Empire to the south, which was Hindu. Now, since we won't really be coming back to discuss it further, this is a survey course, a few quick notes about Hinduism, as it's an integral part of Indian society. Again, as a survey course, this treatment must be superficial, meant only to familiarize you with the most basic aspects of these subjects. Your book does give it a treatment as well, and if you're interested, I recommend reading some books on the subject or taking a course on the history of religion. So here we go. Hinduism. It has a very strong claim to being the oldest, longest-running religion on Earth. This is based on analyses by scholars of the primary text, the Vedas, written in Sanskrit, a language so ancient it was officially declared dead, basically, by the year 600, that's BC, before Christ. That is, no one spoke it any longer. The earliest I've seen the Vedas attributed was 3000 BC, which is just incredible, older than ancient Egypt. However, to outsiders, probably the most famous text is the Bhagavad Gita, which it was the product of much later authorship, from some time during the Maurya Empire, the first to unite almost all of India politically, and this was in the centuries just before the time of Jesus. It is difficult to speak of quote-unquote Hinduism, as this was a name only reluctantly accepted later, imposed as a way of differentiating the various religious peoples of the Indian subcontinent from their Muslim neighbors. But as in any number of other cases you might care to select, the label stuck despite its clumsiness. A few final notes. Hinduism is generally focused on escaping the cycle of reincarnation, that is, rebirth, by rejecting egoistic motives and accepting your place within the caste system. Now, this is different from Buddhism, which, although highly similar philosophically, rejects things like the priestly class of Brahmins and the caste system more generally. Really, they remind me of the difference between Catholics and Protestants in that way. But speaking of people of the book, let's switch gears slightly and end today talking about Islam. It has already been mentioned several times today. Indeed, I could have mentioned it in talking about China, as there is a significant population of Muslims in China. However, I wanted to save it for last because it will segue nicely into carrying over next week to our talk about the Ottoman Empire and the coming together of East and West, quote unquote. Now, as some of you might have noticed, the last supplemental video I posted for this week related to the rise and spread of Islam. Despite their optional nature, you would all greatly benefit from watching these brief and frankly engaging videos, as it will help reinforce what you're hearing in the lectures and reading in your textbook. That being said, you could ace every quiz and exam without watching them, so it's entirely up to you. So, Islam, as you'll see on the slide, I put some important dates up here that you will not be expected to remember, but they do mark some major milestones on the way to Islam spreading across the Arabian Peninsula, up over North Africa, and into Europe. A few things to note about the frankly rapid military and political successes of Muhammad and his successors. We've already talked about the ability to concentrate resources against more loosely organized or entirely unorganized opposition. This is basically what happened during Muhammad's own period. The area we today know as Saudi Arabia, mostly desert then as it is now, had a very low population density and very few large organized polities. Muhammad, having experienced a series of visions in which the Quran, the primary text of Islam, is taken to have been communicated to him by the angel Gabriel, was able to project a degree of unified force that, while not totally unique to the area, was eventually to prove the strongest. And as you can see, he captures the primary holy site, Mecca, shortly before his death. Pushing northward, however, his successors encountered much stiffer resistance in the form of the Byzantine Empire. This was the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, which, being wealthier and more secure behind its incredible walls, outlasted its western half by 1,000 years. This was a serious civilizational and organizational entity. However, the contingent nature of history was on full display here, because as the armies of the new religion were pushing north in the 7th century, they encountered not one, but two great empires, greatly weakened by war and plague, because the Byzantines had been battling continually with the Sassanids. They had been engaged in yet another round of exhausting war. These were the same Sassanids who had conquered the Parthians. They're defeated, and then the Byzantines are defeated decisively at Heliopolis, which opens the door across Egypt into North Africa. Though Constantinople remains safe behind its walls, this will culminate in Muslim forces crossing the narrow strait there, Gibraltar, and taking Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. Almost unbelievably, it isn't until a battle against Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, in the early 700s at Tours, that the invasion of Europe is turned back. So this is incredible. Half a millennia before the First Crusade, and Europe was very nearly Islamized. This was during the period of the Umayyad Caliphate, the largest of any of the subsequent Muslim empires, and the last time all Muslims would be ruled by a single politico-religious authority. Shortly after the defeat at Tours, the Umayyad Caliphate is overthrown, and the Abbasid Caliphate takes its place. And this caliphate, though increasingly in decentralized form, lasts until it's destroyed by the Mongols in 1258. They sack Baghdad and trample the then reigning caliph, that is the politico-religious leader of the Sunni Muslim empire, to death, wrapped in one of those famous Persian rugs, allegedly. And yes, those are the same Mongols we've been talking about since the first lecture. Spoiler alert, they will make one final appearance in our lecture next week when we talk about the development of the Russian Empire. A final note on Islam. I mentioned Shia Islam earlier in the context of Iran and the Safavids. However, that is the smaller of the two predominant Islamic sects, the far larger being the Sunni. The Sunni constitutes about 85% of Muslims, and the major difference between the two sects traces its roots to a dispute over the correct successor to Muhammad and the succession thereafter. Sunni Muslims believe that Abu Bakr, a close companion of Muhammad, was the rightful successor or caliph after the Prophet's death, and they recognize the first four caliphs. And then the Shia Muslims, on the other hand, believe that Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, was the rightful successor, and that leadership should have stayed within Muhammad's family. This fundamental difference in belief about the rightful succession has led to distinct religious practices, traditions, and theological differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims, which we are not going to go into discussing. Okay, so that's your crash course in Islam. Next week is the Ottoman Empire and its neighbors to the north and west as we prepare to bring the nascent kingdoms and states of Europe into our narrative. Thank you all.